Thank you, Janet. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you to all of you. I didn't mention this earlier, but we continue to get stories about how you used your $110 that we received several weeks ago. And thank you for that. And keep those coming, and we'll compile those in some way after the first of the year. But so far, we've supported a community garden right here in Palm Beach County. We've bought backpacks for those that need them. We have supported Planned Parenthood. So all different kinds of ways that we've been touching our community. So thank you for that. And please keep those stories coming. Also, just will share with you, if you hear any hoops and hollers from the back during the remainder of our worship service, it's because our Spanish Seventh-day Adventist hosts here are watching the final game of the World Cup. So, and I thought that they would be all rooting for the same team, but they say they're pretty much split between Argentina and France. So that was interesting. A name is a pretty powerful thing, isn't it? I remember when Trish was pregnant with Emerson, as he would come to be called. It was a pretty difficult thing to think of a name for him that we were going to saddle him with for the rest of his life. And we were laying in bed one night, and Trish was reading an essay by Ralph Waldo Emerson, and on the nightstand by my bed was a biography of Harry Emerson Fosdick, and the great preacher at Riverside Church in New York City for many years. And that name kind of bubbled up as just a great name to name our son. Over the past several years, some professional and college sports teams that took the names of Native Americans in a rather derogatory manner finally listened to folks that decided they didn't want to be team mascots anymore and started changing those names, and that's been kind of a difficult endeavor. The Cleveland Guardians, which refer to two statues that sit near the Cleveland Stadium. No one really knows outside of Cleveland what those Guardians are. Washington, who for 2 years was just called the Washington football team, has changed their name to the Commanders, and not really a way to shorten that. You can't go around calling them the Commies. That wouldn't work. And of course, we all also know names of teams that just fit them perfectly. There's the Pittsburgh Steelers, paying homage to the industry of Pennsylvania. And there's names that are good, and then the teams move. So there's the New Orleans, used to be the New Orleans Jazz, which was a great name for a team from New Orleans. And then they moved to Utah, and the Utah Jazz doesn't quite make much sense. Then, of course, right here in Florida, we have the Orlando Magic, paying reference to the magical theme parks of the Orlando area. So names have to work in order to be effective. And this morning, in both of these passages, one echoing the other, we hear the name Emmanuel, God with us, God taking human form, God, if we allow it to do so, taking away our fear. First of all, in the prophet Isaiah, where King Ahaz was just having a dickens of a time, King Ahaz was the king of Judah. So the nation of Israel, after the time of Solomon, split into two. There was Israel in the north, and there was Judah in the south. And of course, in this time, in this place, not so unlike our time in our place, nations were always warring against each other and trying to take control of the other, trying to get the upper hand so they could amass land and money and power. And that's exactly what was happening then. And so what was taking place is Israel and a neighboring nation, Amar, had made alliances with Assyria, which was a huge warlike country, and so that they would be protected. But they got a little tired of being the vassal nations to Assyria, so they were trying to enlist Judah, this country to the south, King Ahaz's Judah, to join them to fight against Assyria to kind of throw off that oppression. King Ahaz wasn't crazy about that idea because Assyria was a really powerful nation. And so King Ahaz, I'm sure, was afraid. And as you look at the beginning of this passage that Grace just read for us, we notice that we're being invited into a conversation that was already taking place and that was continuing. And so what Ahaz decided to do was to go to the king of Assyria and say, I want to join forces with you because I'm afraid of Israel and Amar. And Isaiah came to King Ahaz. And Isaiah, filled with the Spirit and the wisdom of God, says to King Ahaz, why are you worried? Don't be afraid. Don't feel like you have to take all of this into your own hands and figure it out for yourself. And then he just gives this beautiful word picture. He says, here's what's happening right now. Even in the midst of these circumstances, even in the midst of the anxiety and the fear and the worry, even right now, there's a young woman that's giving birth to a child. And that child's name is going to be Emmanuel, God with us. What a beautiful picture. What a beautiful reminder that even in the most dire of circumstances, the presence of the divine is with us. Fast forward a few hundred years. The nation of Israel still being controlled by a foreign power, the Roman Empire. And in the midst of that world stage, in this little corner, there's the story of Mary and the story of Joseph. And of course, we're familiar with Luke 2 that we'll read next week that shows Mary's understanding of what was taking place and what was happening. We saw that last week and we'll see that again next week. Matthew tells the story of Joseph. Not as big of a character on the Christmas pageant stage. He's kind of just over there in the corner and stays quiet. But Matthew gives us a little insight into his story. And so here's Joseph, who's betrothed, which is kind of engaged times 10 to Mary. It was all done but signing the marriage certificate. And Mary comes to Joseph and reveals that she's pregnant. And Joseph knows that it's not his child. So he wonders what's going on in this culture of patriarchy, in this culture of honor. What is this going to make him look like? That his fiancée is pregnant and we're not quite sure who the father is. And what we're told is the angel Gabriel comes to Joseph just like the angel Gabriel came to Mary. And listen to what the angel says. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Yes, this looks bad. Yes, I'm sure you're full of anxiety and wondering what's going to happen. But don't be afraid. And then the angel quotes this passage from the prophet Isaiah. The words change a little bit. Did you notice that? So no longer is it a woman will conceive and bear a child, but a virgin will conceive and bear a child. And that's the version that we mostly know. It's an unfortunate translation error, actually. And the reason why it's different in Isaiah is because the Hebrew had an understanding of the fact of this word meant a young woman that was of childbearing age. And then when that was translated into the Greek, into the Septuagint, there was a little confusion about that word, a great reminder that every translation is a paraphrase. There are decisions that needed to be made. Every translation is an interpretation, and whoever was interpreting that for the Septuagint changed that word to virgin, had a different understanding of that. And the reason that I say it's unfortunate is this. First of all, it played into the culture of a patriarchal society where men were just terribly obsessed with women's virginity. And then second of all, that kind of takes it out of the everyday. And it doesn't help us to understand that the presence of the divine, incarnating, becoming creation, becoming human, isn't just the stuff of special miracles. The incarnation of the divine God with us is the stuff of everyday miracles. Not just for those special people, but for all of us. Nevertheless, the angel said, "Don't worry. Don't be afraid, Joseph. The woman will conceive and bear a child, and that child's name will be Emmanuel, God with us." In the midst of the uncertainty of these family relationships, there's Emmanuel, there's God with us. In the midst of the fact that you are a small nation occupied by an empire that mistreats you, there is Emmanuel, God with us. Fast forward a few more centuries, a couple of millennia, to us here in this place, dealing with the circumstances that we're dealing with personally, the illnesses, the grief of those that we've lost. Living in a nation who, I don't think it's too dramatic to say, whose future is uncertain. On a planet whose future is uncertain. Does the same message ring true to our hearts? That there is Emmanuel, that there is God with us. And you might say, well, Jason, it sure would be nice if we had a prophet that could come to our house directly and tell us what's going to happen. Not that that helped Ahaz too much. Ahaz just went ahead and did what Ahaz was going to do and caused him and his nation all manner of grief. Wouldn't it be nice to have an angel come to us like an angel came to Joseph and explain this is what the story is? To which, by the way, Joseph responded much better and became a wonderful father to young Jesus. We don't at least think that we have that. But is there a way that we can experience that Emmanuel, that God with us. Of course, we, as a particular people of faith, believe that there is. Through stopping, through pausing, through taking a little bit of time and a little bit of step back and being quiet and allowing ourselves to experience the sacred silence, as Bruce just sang for us. To allow ourselves to hear and experience the voice of the still speaking God. All kind of ways that we can do that we talk about all the time, through meditation, through centering prayer, through spending time in Scripture, through spending time outside in sacred space. And here's the benefit of that. It doesn't just help us in the moment to take a deep breath and to experience a little bit of peace. A lot of times it does. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes our mind just automatically goes to all of those circumstances that we're facing, that we're engaged with. But even when it doesn't relieve those anxieties and those fears just in the moment, it still brings us peace. It creates a little bit of, like we talked about last week, sacred space, a little bit of a pause. And as we practice that, as we experience that, there's the possibility that there's a little bit of space between us and those circumstances that we're experiencing. So when somebody cuts me off in traffic, I don't go through the mechanical process of letting every bad word that I know fly and get my blood pressure and my heart rate up. That there's a little bit of space where I can sit back and examine my response before I'm in the middle of my response. And my goodness, don't we need that sense of peace in our lives? Don't we need that ability to say, where is the God with us in this situation? So when something happens to me personally, before I spin, I'm able to stop and recognize that presence of God with us. As I'm engaged with other folks and something rubs me the wrong way, that I have a little bit of space to think and to feel and to experience the God with us, Emmanuel. In the circumstances of life, in the circumstances of our world, is there time for me to hear the prophets and the angels that are amongst us? Maybe not in the same way as Isaiah and Joseph experienced it. But how attuned are we in the busyness of life to the prophets that are amongst us? I'm reminded of William Barber and Moral Mondays and the Poor People's Campaign. People that are consistently and strongly pointing us as a society to another way. A way that we don't often spend a whole lot of time paying attention to, because we're so involved and invested in the way that the world is now. What if there was some time and some space to hear the angels? To hear what Abraham Lincoln referred to as the better angels, speaking at a time that was also full of strife and division. Listen to what he says in his first inaugural address. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic chords of memory will swell when again touched, as surely they will be by the better angels of our nature. There is the promise of peace in the midst of our circumstances, in the midst of our lives. It's not a peace that comes from the situations and circumstances necessarily changing. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But as we step back, as we create that sacred space for peace, we touch a sacred knowing that goes beyond the circumstances as they appear. And we have the opportunity to experience that peace ourselves. And having experienced that peace ourselves, we have the opportunity to practice that peace in the midst of our relationships, in the midst of our lives. It doesn't mean that there's not conflict and that there's not disagreements and things that we don't see eye to eye about. But we are promised that in the midst of those conflicts that are a part of life and that are necessary, we have the opportunity to practice God with us. We have the opportunity to make space for the fact that there is a sacred knowing that goes even beyond your opinion and my opinion. And that if we sit with it, if we practice, there's the possibility for us coming into that sacred knowing. What an opportunity we have to practice that as people of faith in the midst of a world that just eat each other's throats. Got the chance to catch up on a little bit of news yesterday and came to understand that the incoming House majority is having a little bit of a difficulty picking who their leader is going to be, fighting amongst themselves. And also heard the story, and I haven't been following the royal family. I'm not a big royal family follower, but of Meghan making the statement that when she was there with the royal family, that at occasions that nobody was allowed to wear the same color as somebody higher up in the royal ladder. And at the next occasion that the royal family had opportunity, they all wore the same clothes, same color of clothes. This back and forth, this nitpicking among the most powerful people in our nation. And we have the opportunity to practice another way, a way of sacred knowing, a way of God with us, a way of peace. Let's pray together.